We'll skip forward a bit then to the end of May because at that point something significant happened over in America because Juan Pablo Montoya won the Indy 500. At this point, Montoya was contracted to his Ganassi team in America until the end of 2001, and his team boss Chip Ganassi was adamant that he would be staying out there until then. But we'll use Montoya's Indy win to round up what Button referred to in his book as, quotes, the Juan Pablo Montoya situation. Jenson even capped up the S on situation there, so that's how you know it's serious. Williams had said at the start of the year it was potentially interested in bringing Montoya back for 2001, which would require buying him out of the 3-year Ganassi loan deal it had arranged. But Frank said early on that it was on Jenson to show he can keep Montoya out, and Jenson said in his book that Frank was upfront about wanting to bring Montoya back. Mark, we'll get Jim's perspective on this in a moment, but from the outside, were you getting an impression that Jenson was probably keeping that seat warm for Montoya?
Yeah, it did feel a bit like that. Montoya was seen as the next big thing, and Button's stature wasn't quite that, but was building, and he was making things awkward by being so good so soon, but not in a way which was threatening Montoya's arrival there, I didn't feel. And with Ralph on a long contract, it was always difficult to envisage Jenson being at Williams more than just that season initially. But the feeling was that he'd showed well enough already to be in demand elsewhere. But yeah, I think it was assumed that this was Montoya's seat for 2001.
The Montoya story dragged on for most of the year, and Button couldn't get away from it. I've gone back and watched loads of the TV footage, read loads of the magazine reports and interviews and that, and during the middle of the year, like, you can feel Jenson's pain when he keeps getting asked about this and he's got nothing he can really say about it. Williams said before the Indy 500 win that it had asked Ganassi if Montoya would be available a year early, but as the speculation increased, the team stuck to this line, saying it was up to Chip Ganassi to decide if he would let him come back a year early. Autosport reported as early as June that the decision was made for Montoya to replace Button, but Williams kept denying it, leaving Button facing questions every weekend about if he was losing his drive at the end of the year. All summer, Button just had to keep saying that nobody knew what was going on and he would be the first to know if he was losing his drive. In his book, he took aim at the media, who he felt pursued a narrative of the Montoya situation unsettling him. And Button wrote, "It wasn't accurate, but at the same time, it increased the noise around me, a sense of things unravelling, which again was a perception, not the reality. I hoped to somehow show Frank that I was worth keeping, but how that would work with Ralph and Juan Pablo, I didn't know." And he said Frank finally told him about halfway through the year that Montoya was taking his seat. Jim, what was going on at Williams during this time? How early was that decision taken on Montoya? And was there some sympathy from within the team that, you know, when it wasn't, even though it hadn't been announced, Jenson was taking a lot of hassle from the media over his future?
Well, again, the background is useful here. BMW, having got over the early setbacks with the first engine, were now confident that for 2001 they would have a world beater. And therefore they wanted to recognise top-line drivers, experienced drivers. And I think, as you said, Juan Pablo was seen as someone very, very special. Frank had loaned him to Chip Ganassi, as you say. And the feeling was, although Jenson was showing a lot of promise, he wasn't yet ready to win Grand Prix, perhaps, whereas Juan Pablo probably was. So it was en route to the Canadian Grand Prix in June that Frank and myself met with Chip Ganassi and a lawyer representing Juan Pablo. And the deal was done. So that was en route to the Canadian Grand Prix. And then, as you say, a little bit later on in the summer, Frank let Jenson know we wouldn't be taking up our option on him. But he was also at pains to say that you will come back and drive for Williams at a future date. That's what we would like. And as you know, there were at times options between Williams and Button, which famously erupted at a later date. But that's the story to it. And I think, history tells us that Juan Pablo and Ralph made a very, very strong team, and that BMW did produce a stonking engine for 2001. So all of that was the right decisions. And, if there's criticism for the Williams management team, we had a very, very healthy deck of cards in front of us. Something had to give.
And what about the timing? Because I know in the end, the Montoya deal was announced. Well, when we'll probably come to it later, but at Indy, which is obviously late in the season and where he had a lot of recognition. Was that a deliberate thing? And it's just kind of on the team and Jenson to muddle through the months in between where the decision's made and everyone's kind of got to pretend that they don't know.
Yeah, and very few people did know. It was literally a handful of people within the Williams organisation that did know. And Frank wanted Jenson to keep focused. He didn't want him to be distracted. Inevitably, the media speculation was a distraction. But again, with good intent, he wanted Jenson to be really, really focused because he really wanted to give Jenson a good chance and see what he could do over the season.
Did discussions ever get to the point of, okay, we do think Jenson will come back for 2003? Was it ever discussed which driver he would have replaced out of Ralph and Juan Pablo?
I think these things evolve, and what we saw was Ralph reaching very, very high levels, probably levels beyond what we actually thought he was capable. I'd be interested in getting Mark's opinion on that. But there were some years in the early 2000s where Ralph really was driving impeccably, very, very quick. If he had a weakness, it was his ability to overtake. But if he started at the front and made a good start, he'd be gone. Really, really strong, quick driver. And then, of course, Juan Pablo, who, became a darling of the Williams team with his never say die attitude. He wasn't afraid of Michael Schumacher. He would take him on the inside, the outside. It didn't matter. So I guess those two drivers reaching the peak of their Formula One careers, and again, be interested to hear Mark's perspective on this, made it more difficult for us to bring Jenson back, particularly when Jenson wasn't setting the world on fire at Benetton.
Yeah, I think the expectation is that Juan Pablo would emerge as the clear number one when he joined. Ralph, who was considered a quick driver, but he wasn't this unstoppable force that Montoya was, as you say. But actually, when the car was well balanced, as the sort of mid-2003, the car really switched on. Ralph was incredibly quick, especially through the fast corners, and sort of a more precise way of exploiting the last few milliseconds from the car than Juan Pablo's more flamboyant approach, let's say. And I think in those situations he was genuinely quicker than Montoya, and I think even now today Montoya will acknowledge that, and he said it took him by surprise as well. But as an all-rounder, as someone who was always going to sort of come through no matter what, your money would always have gone on Juan Pablo. But in a certain specific situation where the car was well balanced and just as he liked it, Ralph could be unbeatable.